Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, a tale of the media and two cities, Beijing and New York. Bloomberg, the New York Times, and what their stories tell us about the state of journalism in China. A soap opera from Colombia that makes heroes out of drug dealers and murderers. It's getting great ratings, but is it good for the country? Turkey cements its status as the world's biggest jailer of journalists. And Russians getting all exercised over the upcoming Winter Olympics. Once again, we're going underground for our web video of the week. 2 weeks ago, we reported on Beijing's efforts to control its domestic media. This week, we're going to take a look at the international side of that issue. Over the past decade, the global media's presence in China has nearly doubled, an indication of the value news organizations place on the story unfolding there. And there is concern at the official level over what gets covered. On November 7th, it was reported that the New York-based Bloomberg news agency had self-censored reports on the business ties of senior government officials because the story could have jeopardized Bloomberg's working relationship with the Chinese. That's an allegation that Bloomberg has denied. China does have the world's second largest economy and is therefore a huge story for Bloomberg, which made its reputation covering financial news. And Bloomberg has already taken a hit in China. Its website is down and has been ever since another expose that it did last year on the private wealth of relatives of China's leader, Xi Jinping. In our last story out of Beijing, we spoke with Chinese journalists and academics. This time, 4 non-Chinese voices on the trade-off that international news organizations sometimes have to make to report the news in China.
There's been an increased scrutiny on the foreign media in China.
Despite the Chinese government's robust censorship apparatus, a lot of news trickles back in.
They try to make sure that people are apprehensive.
And that's the effect they want to have. You know, you're always looking over your shoulder.
Bloomberg News has had reason to look over its shoulder in China ever since last year, when it ran an explosive piece of investigative journalism on the man about to take charge of the Chinese Communist Party. Bloomberg reported that Xi Jinping's family held assets valued at more than $2 billion. The article did not trace the assets to the man himself, just his relatives, nor did it accuse Xi of personal wrongdoing. However, the message was clear, the damage was done. And Bloomberg threw in a quote for good measure, Xi talking in 2004 about the ruling party, corruption, and family. Rein in your spouses, children, relatives, friends, and staff, he said, and vow not to use power for personal gain.
All around the world, senior leaders in politics have family members who probably benefit from their connections with the leaders of their country. And China is no different. But what is different is that the Chinese government and the Communist Party are trying to set themselves up as this model where everyone is equal, people in the positions of power don't get favors, they're trying to crack down on corruption. And basically what the Bloomberg report did was to kind of expose with numbers for the first time the extent to which some of the family members of senior politicians, and particularly at that time the incoming president of China, Xi Jinping, how much wealth they'd accumulated.
They didn't imply that these officials had done anything wrong, but the implication is, how did their families become so wealthy? And it's known that Communist Party officials, that their families have benefited from their involvement with state enterprises and from their connection with senior officials. And so the government was quite upset.
The Chinese government reacted very directly. Actually, the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. visited and spoke with senior editors at Bloomberg, trying to urge them not to run the story, though they did in the end. And then afterwards, there was some retaliation, apparently, in terms of the sale of their terminals. Their website was blocked. Now, they don't have a whole lot of readership inside China, but it still sent a signal to be careful. If they someday want to have a Chinese language website, that they're not going to have access to Chinese people if they report stories like this.
The New York Times had a similar problem last year when it reported on another power family, that of now former Prime Minister Wen Jiabao, after the Times detailed the family controlling assets worth $2.7 billion. Its website was blocked as well. As for the latest Bloomberg development, the Times also played a role in that. In a story first reported in Taiwan and then extensively in the New York Times, it was alleged that Bloomberg spiked a story it had been working on for a year, into the ties between China's richest man, Wang Zhenlin, and members of the Politburo Standing Committee, the ruling party's inner circle. The Times reported the story was ready for publication, but that Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, Matthew Winkler, killed it and told colleagues on a conference call that to run the story would jeopardize Bloomberg's position in China. Bloomberg has denied the story, even though the Times' version of it says the paper had 4 different sources inside Bloomberg confirming it. And the Financial Times' Hong Kong correspondent reported the same story, again quoting sources inside Bloomberg.
I spent a lot of time going back and forth with Bloomberg over email, also with Mr. Winkler, and put the question to him, why do you think you're going to be kicked out of China if you run these stories? Is that what you really said to your reporters on the conference call? And for a man who encourages his reporters to be very aggressive when they're talking to senior business leaders, he was very reluctant to give anything more than a short and simple answer.
The increased openness of China that we have seen over the past decade and a half or so means that there are more Chinese people who can read English and other foreign languages, and therefore it becomes more important for the Chinese government from its perspective to keep track of what is actually being written in those foreign media. That's the change we're seeing, that the Chinese government is aware of the fact that a lot is being written and that it contradicts the image of itself that it wants to promote, and that is why it is being more restrictive and more aggressive in terms of attacking Western media.
The other trump card Beijing occasionally plays against foreign journalists is the visa. Over the past 2 years, it has denied or significantly delayed issuing visas to reporters from Bloomberg, the New York Times, Al Jazeera, and Reuters, among others. And in the Reuters case, the reporter is what's known in the business as an old China hand.
The interesting thing is that I was there for 18 years and I never was called in, I was never reprimanded, they never said anything to me. So I was a bit surprised that my application for a visa was turned down. They said they gave no reason. They later issued a statement saying it was in accordance with Chinese law, but they haven't said what laws I might have broken.
Every now and then they just do something like this as a kind of warning signal to others, and the victim they choose to do it to it's almost a random decision. It's just to keep everybody on their toes and to remind everybody that hang on, there's still a bottom line you can't cross, and if we get angry with you, we can do this to you, and there's nothing you can do against it.
We're also seeing situations where it's not an individual journalist because of their reporting that is being denied or delayed, having their visa delayed, but that somebody will be told, we're not processing your visa because of something your predecessor wrote, or a bureau chief is having their visa delayed so that they can't go and get into China even if there are some reporters there. So you start to see these kinds of responses and reactions that really have a collective impact on the media organization as a whole.
Viewers will have noticed no comments or interviews with Chinese officials in this report. It wasn't for lack of trying. We contacted the Foreign Ministry's International Press Center, which did not respond. Neither did one other department, Beijing's Ministry of Propaganda. But with a name like that, is an official comment really even necessary? Our Global Village voice is now on international news outlets and their coverage of China.
I think the majority of news reporting about China by international agencies can be considered to be relatively lazy. In general, reporting unfortunately seems to fall into one of 2 categories. Either of China as a huge, powerful economic leviathan, or on the other hand, China as a fundamentally broken society. In reality, of course, it's much more nuanced.
As a superpower, it has to take into account a constant flow of criticism from all over the world. Yet this exaggerated sensitivity is only partially due to the need of maintaining social stability. 2 other relevant factors are a deep-rooted victim mentality, but also the inheritance of a social system in which nowadays the idea of a free press still struggles to take roots.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. The latest developments from Turkey will do nothing to help the country's reputation as being one of the world's biggest prisoner of journalists. 3 reporters working for critical media outlets have been sentenced to life after being found guilty of, quote, trying to overthrow the constitutional order by means of violence, unquote. Fusun Erdogan, the founder of Ozgur Radio, as well as Ibrahim Çiçek and Bayram Namaz of Atalim magazine, were accused of being among the leaders of the Marxist-Leninist Communist Party, the MLKP. A fourth journalist, Sedat Sanoliu, who publishes Atalim, was jailed for 7.5 years. All of the reporters involved were arrested 7 years ago and have been imprisoned ever since. The Paris-based press freedom group Reporters Without Borders is calling for the release of the four and said these extremely harsh sentences have ended a trial marked by violations of defense rights and unacceptably long pretrial detention for the main defendants. What happened to the presumption of innocence? The MLKP has been classified as a terror organization by Ankara, with alleged links to the banned Kurdish separatist movement, the PKK. Turkey has more journalists in jail than any other country in the world, ahead of China and Iran. According to the latest figures from the US-based Committee to Protect Journalists, at least 49 are behind bars. In Thailand, a webmaster has lost an appeal against a conviction under the country's controversial internet law in a legal case that triggered a debate about freedom of expression online. On November the 8th, Bangkok's Court of Appeals upheld an 8-month suspended jail sentence for Chiranuch Premchaporn. Premchaporn was first arrested in 2009 and initially faced up to 20 years in jail after being found guilty of not removing comments from her website, Prachatai, that were deemed insulting to the royal family. That sentence was eventually reduced to 8 months last year, but in this latest ruling, the appeal court agreed that Premchaporn had violated Articles 14 and 15 of the Computer Crimes Act, which punishes anyone who publishes false data that could, quote, damage a third party, cause public panic, or undermine the country's security, unquote. The Thai monarchy is protected by what's called Article 112. It's a decades-old law that prohibits anyone criticizing the royal family. The Computer Crimes Act, implemented back in 2007, simply extended that law to the internet. Greek riot police have been criticized for forcibly evicting employees of the former state broadcaster, ERT. The employees had been holed up in the station for 5 months, ever since the Greek government announced it was closing down the broadcaster, it said, because of wasteful spending. At 4 a.m. on November 7th, riot police stormed the ERT complex in Athens. They cordoned off the building, used tear gas to disperse the crowds, and made a series of arrests. The raid prompted a demonstration in support of those evicted. Defending the action, government spokesman Simos Kedikoglu said the government wanted to apply the law and restore legality, and that the building had been under illegal occupation. ERT's ex-workers continued to broadcast online on this website after their eviction. Greece now has another state-owned broadcaster, which has been on the air since August. On The Listening Post, we spend a lot of time analyzing news reporting, but we also like to explore other types of TV narratives because fiction, even soap operas, can provide a window on society. Colombians produce lots of soap operas, and their so-called telenovelas are seen across Latin America. But they're changing. Away from romantic fairy tales and family dramas, Colombia is now producing grittier fare, stories about narco-trafficking, which have been a huge hit. Earlier this year, however, one series on a crime family upset a lot of people there. The show dramatized the story of the Castaño brothers, leaders of a right-wing paramilitary group. Critics say the program made heroes out of murderers and drug traffickers, and it ignored the voices of their victims. But the ratings are just too good for the genre to die out anytime soon. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on Colombia's narco-novellas and the historical and political baggage that's weighing them down.
For years, the Colombian telenovela has been a staple for TV viewers around Latin America. Cinderella storylines, melodramatic close-ups, the long episodic build-ups to the happily ever after. But that narrative, rehashed and rerun, got old, and audiences got tired. Then came the narco-novella, slick, glamorous thrillers on the Colombian drugs world.
Soy Pedro Pablo León Jaramillo.
A genre revamped, topping the ratings and exported around the Spanish-speaking continent.
People got bored with the lack of innovation, and around 7 years ago we started producing narco-novellas, which took the reality of the streets into people's front rooms.
si los televisores fueran las ventanas de las casas.
TV really became a window to our world, and they've been very popular ever since.
En las preferencias de la gente.
Colombia siempre se ha distinguido por ser...
Colombia has always been the audiovisual mecca in this continent. Our dramas stand out from the other producers in Latin America. It's amazing how an anti-hero like a narco-trafficker captivates audiences. He's at once complex, yet human, and that's why people fall in love with him.
Television has the power to build social imaginaries and construct the way people see the world. Problem is, narco-novellas communicate that the definition of success is to get rich at all costs, and that anything goes, for narcos and for politicians. And that's had a very damaging impact on Colombian society.
Narco-novellas have always had their critics. Excessive violence, they say. But this year, one narco-novella sparked a new kind of controversy.
Tres Caínes.
Because the story went to the heart of Colombia's painful political history. Los Tres Caínes, the Three Cains, tells the story of the Castaño brothers, the real-life founders of one of Colombia's most notorious paramilitary groups. Set up to fight left-wing guerrillas, they killed thousands, were knee-deep in drugs trafficking, often with the blessing of the country's political elite. But the drama doesn't sit well with journalists who've tried to tell the real story.
The problem is that the Castaño brothers are presented as heroes. Their evil sides are shown too, that's true. But those of us who have made films know perfectly well that the public end up feeling more sympathetic towards those who are on screen the most.
Estos guerrilleros son el cáncer de este país, señores. Y nosotros los castaños nos vamos a encargar de exterminarlos.
When a story so complicated is told in such large brushstrokes, the story tends to get distorted and the murderers end up legitimized.
Cuando hay críticas, uno tiene que escuchar.
When there is criticism, we have to listen to it. And some people told me they felt underrepresented and that I should have given the victim's point of view. But there's no way the channel would have bought that, because they want to use famous figures already etched on the Colombian psyche. If I'd have pitched a series about a peasant called Alfonso Gomez, who was murdered or displaced, it would have been rejected, because it doesn't have the same resonance as the Tres Caínes.
On the one hand, the series apologizes for the paramilitaries by giving them the status of sex symbols. On the other, the victims come across as wide-eyed innocents who didn't really understand what they were doing. All those clichés are offensive because the political opposition come across as totally idiotic.
José Antequera's father, a left-wing politician, was murdered in 1989 by paramilitary forces. When Los Tres Caínes hit TV screens, Antequera campaigned, along with others, to get sponsors to pull their advertising. The protest made some inroads. 5 major brands, including Nivea, withdrew their ads from prime-time slots on RCN.
Riñe contra la libertad de expresión, contra la libertad de empresa.
These kinds of campaigns undermine freedom of expression. The ratings prove that a lot of people want to see these shows. So people who don't need to use the remote control and change the channel. They shouldn't stop other people watching what is a true story of our country.
In the context of such a violent history, the 2 main private channels have a massive social responsibility. They can't just say, if you don't like it, turn over. Recently, there's been an avalanche of shows where the lives of all the capos of this country have been serialized into a soap opera. Enough is enough.
No creo que quitarle la publicidad.
Withdrawing advertising is not censorship. The channel's main goal is to sell. So their defense is that they're just giving people what they want, like fast food sellers who say their food must be good because people buy it, despite plenty of proof that junk food has 0 nutritional value.
The job of fiction writers is to engage us, so they use storytelling devices. They take dramatic license, they exaggerate, if necessary, and edit things out to draw us in. It's the job of the news media to tell the true story. The problem is that news outlets in Colombia have often shied away from thoroughly covering all sides of what for Colombians has been the country's defining conflict. And some of the journalists who've tried have found themselves in trouble. Holman Morris is one of them. He's been covering Colombia for a decade, and he's one reporter who became a target through death threats and then a smear campaign by former President Álvaro Uribe, who falsely accused Morris of having ties with the FARC guerrilla. He's now the director of Canal Capital, a public broadcaster.
I think that private TV have a social responsibility. In a country like Colombia, which has the second worst humanitarian record in the world, with 50,000 people disappeared, to a large extent due to the actions of the Castaño brothers, that social responsibility needs to take the form of another type of drama. One about our history, about our victims, which has never been taken into consideration in this country. Quite the opposite. They were ignored.
You have to distinguish how different genres have covered this armed conflict. One is the news media. There have been factual reports by independent journalists who have given the victims accounts. But the problem on these commercial channels is that they blur the facts to produce fiction.
These channels are taking advantage of a political story to produce narco-dramas, and they're forgetting to respect the dignity of the victims. When it comes to historical memory in this country, we demand a socially responsible media, because what's at stake are the rights of the victims and the fight for transitional justice to pave the way to peace.
With a slew of narco-novellas in production, that seems unlikely. So for the time being, this genre will carry on being the other Colombian export that's not necessarily all that good for you.
More Global Village voices now on Colombia and the narco-novellas that are watched all over Latin America.
Hay que tener en cuenta que el paramilitarismo en Colombia no es algo que se encuentre inactivo, el paramilitarismo continúa. La historia de los tres Caínes no fue una historia de ficción, fue una realidad supremamente dolorosa para Colombia que no ha encontrado la justicia aún. Inevitablemente este tipo de series generan una empatía hacia los tres personajes porque los muestra como personas que se vieron envueltas en una dinámica imposible de salir y cuya única opción era generar violencia como del tipo que generaron.
It is not normal that citizens have to tell televisions they are doing something wrong. Censorship is the worst thing I could think of, but if everything else fails, I think it's good that the responsibility comes from brands and from normal people. Our children cannot grow up seeing that being a criminal is good.
Finally, for the second straight week, we have a web video of the week that was shot in a subway system. Last time it was New York, this time it's Moscow. The Winter Olympics are coming up in Sochi, and someone in Russia came up with a novel scheme that combines marketing with a fitness program. Muscovites using the Vochnaia station last week spotted a new machine that offered free subway tickets in exchange for a little exercise. Passengers could save 30 rubles by doing 30 leg squats. Olympic Changes is the name of the video. It's another feel-good production set underground, and it's our viral video of the week. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.